Well, good afternoon. I want to thank each and every one of you for coming, and I want to thank all of those online who are attending the course this way. Thank you for your attendance. I am told that we have somewhere over 100 students, somewhere around 130 students signed up for this particular course on national politics. And I've taught this, for those of you who do not know me, my name is Professor Michael Hall. I am a professor of political science in the political science department here at Wichita State University. And I've been at Wichita State University since the fall of 2008. I've been teaching here for a long time. And I've taught this course, National Politics, 2 times before. First time was in 2016. That was quite an interesting experience to teach it for the first time then, and also in 2018. I tend to specialize in election years, as you can tell. And now, of course, with it being 2020, I can see a few familiar faces, I think, in the audience who are taking this course again. Thank you for that vote of support, but also a number of faces I don't recognize. Please allow me some housekeeping matters that, to talk, since especially this is the first lecture we're giving on this course, some housekeeping duties that some of which they've asked me to pass on to you and those of you, watching from home, and also some things that I need to say as well about this course. The management has asked me to tell everyone to make sure to either turn off your cell phones or put them on vibrate. I remembered to put mine on vibrate at the last minute, and I've had too many classes where somebody is having their phone annoyingly go off and interrupting a class, and then I find out it's mine. So if you can, do a favor to your neighbors who would appreciate it, please either shut off the phone or put it on vibrate. 2 hours where you do not have to deal with that and think of something else can sometimes be, a wonderful wonderful break in the day. Also, for those of you who are interested in asking questions of me, that's perfectly fine. We do have a microphone set up on the right hand, to my right, your left. We have a microphone set up for people who would like to ask me questions. What I will tend to do is I'll be taking a break midway through this session. I'll be, after about an hour, we'll have a full break. What I'll try and do is to leave some time for questions before we get to that break, if I remember. Unfortunately, it's true what they say about professors and absent-mindedness. I may forget, but I intend to invite time for questions after I've done some talking from the audience. So please go up to the microphone so that everyone can hear these questions. And please remember, it's also being recorded. Those who are going to be seeing this at home on their computers would also like to hear the questions. I'll repeat those questions to make sure everyone can hear them as best as I can. But please make sure to go up to the microphone. Please speak into it. That's the best way for it to catch you. And I'll try and answer your questions as best as I can. We'll see how many questions we can get through in the time we have allotted. And if there is a line, for whatever reason, please remember, of course, this is the age of social distancing. I'm sure the person who's talking at the microphone would appreciate it if you were about 6 feet, 2 meters, away from that. And then the person lining up behind them, a bit of a distance away from them as well, just so that, everyone can be as safe as we can in an environment like this. You will realize, of course, as you can see, I'm not wearing a mask. I was told just early, I was planning to wear a mask actually, but I was told beforehand that this microphone is something they're only going to be using for me. So I'm not infecting potentially any other professor, hopefully, at any time later on. And so we are taking precautions. And I do have to, I'm told I do not have to wear a mask, partly because since I'm going to be using my voice to make sure that, you're heard. And, some people, I'm sure, in the room and some people watching this online will be concerned about being able to hear me. And, so being able to hear me, I'm going to speak with the mask off, and the management will take all kinds of precautions. I'll try and take precautions too, to make sure that we're not to make sure that we're not spreading disease unnecessarily. I do have a mask with me. If you want to talk with me in person, I'll be sure to put that mask on. We will have a break in the middle of a session. Psychological research I've been told about says that people can only hold their attention for about maybe 22, 25 minutes at a time, which is perfectly fine for watching a sitcom on TV. But when you're listening to a lecture, things drag on. We're going to take a break in the middle. And I'll make sure you know when that starts and stops. And we may also be getting questions via email from those who are watching this online. Mr. Herdano has volunteered to read out those questions. Should we get those sometime during the class as well? So if you're wondering who's asking the question, I don't see someone at the microphone. Some of those who are taking it online may be asking questions as well. I do appreciate it that I do appreciate seeing so many faces wearing masks and sitting so far apart. And I appreciate all the efforts a lot of you are taking to make sure everyone is safe during this time. It's of course an odd period of time for us. Normally, when I teach this course, and when I teach a lot of my courses, I try and involve a lot of discussion. I've been teaching American politics for several years now, and I've always found that a lot of the best learning comes from engaging people in discussion. And so there are times, instead of hearing me lecture, I would ask questions of the audience and get their responses back. And then 2020 happened. And we now have a case where I have to be very distant from, I have to be very distant from you. We have to be distant from each other. And I was told that, I was basically having to reconsider in my mind the way I teach these courses. If you've seen this course in the past, you'll know that I engage a lot of discussion. I try and draw out lessons from that discussion. And I'll be doing, unfortunately, less of that here. What it means is that I'll be doing more talking this time around, and still trying to allow time for questions when available. But for those of you who've seen me before, you'll end up hearing me talk a bit more than you used to hearing me talk. You can decide for yourselves if that's a good thing or not. But this is, we're going to end up, changing some of the normal format of the way things are done in the course. Hopefully, you'll find some of the thoughts and some of the thoughts that I try and offer somewhat enlightening, or at least thought-provoking, so you can think more of think more deeply about politics in your own way, in your own shape, in your own way, in your own shape or form. I do ask. Let's see. I think that's all I have for now. If things come up, I'll make sure to inform you further of various points. Please also, one further thing, please realize too that, while I have been teaching American politics, Introduction to American Politics, for several years. In fact, ever since I've been here at Wichita State. So I've been teaching that course to, what must be hundreds, over 1,000 students by now. That being said, my research interests and most of my teaching interests are actually in international relations. And that is, so I come at this subject from a bit of a different angle, but I am familiar with a lot of political science broadly, and I'll be trying to share with you some of what we've learned through research to enlighten some of the things that don't always come up just by watching the news. All right, and that's part of where that's basically a lot of what I'm hoping to contribute in a course like this. We have four different sessions. Today's session, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about what is most fundamental in American politics, which is basically the Constitution. And next week, I'll be spending the time talking about elections and things we've learned about how elections work, trying to tie it in with obviously what is an election year, and talking about elections as this interesting interactive game that is played between candidates, parties, and voters. On the third session, which will come 2 weeks from now, we'll spend more time talking about lobbying and the role of what we call interest groups. Interest groups being organized groups of citizens who are not part of the government, but they try and push the government to adopt certain policies. And in the last session, and we may do some of this on the third session as well, we'll talk about the policy-making process, the actual business of governing. How do, the actual process of governing, that is to say, how do new policies get adopted? What's the process that it goes through, and who's most crucially involved in the actual governing process in the United States? So that's a sense of where we're going with this. Please note that I've not required any reading for this particular course. I've not required any particular assignments for you to write. Normally, this is the point where young people would be exuberantly and joyful. But I'm just letting you know that the expectations are basically participation and your feedback, or questions are welcome. All right. Actually, I could use your feedback, to start this off. I'm not going to dispense with discussion entirely, but this is going to require some of you being a bit as loud as you can, if you're not near the microphone. Suppose for the sake of argument, you know of a person who is an immigrant to the United States. They want to become a naturalized citizen of the United States. They want to go through a legal process of becoming a US citizen. And if you've not heard about this before, they may tell you that there's a number of requirements they have to go through to become a legal citizen of the US, one of which is to take a test. Not a math test, it's not an English test, it's a civics test. People becoming citizens of the United States are required to know something about our history and our Constitution. And they'll have been told this by the immigration officials. And so suppose this person asks you, all right, I need to learn about the Constitution. I know I can find it online, but could you at least give me a summary or basics? Could you tell me what I should be looking at? Because I did find it online, and boy, it's a long document in legal terms. What do I need to know? If you had to try and summarize some of the key points, the really essential points in the Constitution, what are some things you could mention? You just have to yell out one. Raise your hand and yell out one, maybe. Freedom of speech, I heard. Okay, freedom of speech. 3 branches of government, thank you. Sorry, ma'am. Yeah. Could you say it one more time? Independent branches of government, that's right. We have not only 3 branches of government, but they are independent of each other, and we take this for granted, but they are selected through different processes from each other. Hold on a second. Let me write this down. Some of those who are watching this online will be able to see what's on the screen that you see to my left and to my right. So we have freedom of speech that was mentioned. Whoops. Still getting used to this keyboard. My students in my regular classes will tell you they've noticed a common thing. I have a hard time talking and writing at the same time. I'm not the best multitasker. So 3 independent branches of government. What else is important to know about the Constitution? Yes, sir. All right. I'm going to try and summarize that in one word, and that is federalism. That we have different layers of government, and that's enshrined in the Constitution as well. But the national level government, what we call the federal government, is of course supreme over the states, and the Constitution does say that. What else is essential in the Constitution? Due process, right. That we are not a nation run so much by people, but a nation run by laws, for example, and there's supposed to be a legal procedure that is meant to apply to every citizen somewhat equally. Good. Other things you can think of. Yes, in the center again. Guaranteed rights. So I'm going to go back up to freedom of speech up there, because it's not just speech, obviously, is it? It's freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom to assemble, like we're doing now, for example. Rights to own guns, rights to make sure, that we can keep, we do not, we are given certain due process of law in case of criminal, in case we are accused of crimes for whatever reason. These are all, these are, as I'm going to mention later, are all called civil liberties as a matter of law. They are freedoms that are given to us in the Bill of Rights, obviously. But they're also in the Bill of Rights, liberties in the sense that we are free to do things, and we're guaranteed to have these freedoms. Rights in the sense that governments owe us these things. Anything else that came to mind? Yes, sir, way in the back. Powers of Congress, that's right. In the very first article of the Constitution, Article 1 actually defines and sets up the Congress of the United States. And it defines about 17 different powers that the Congress could have, many of which were not in the older document, the Articles of Confederation, which was how we were running the United States shortly after the Revolution. Congress was given some much greater powers than what the previous Congress had under the Articles of Confederation. And the Constitution strengthened the Congress, and by extension, the federal government in the process. You're on a roll. Anything else you can think of? Yes, in the front. Yeah. It's not the most exciting part of the Constitution. It's not the first one that comes to mind. I've done this exercise with so many classes of different age groups. And Americans, when they're asked this question, what are the essentials of the Constitution? They think of civil liberties and the checks and balances right away. But the amendment process is important. We would not have the Bill of Rights in the Constitution if the Constitution did not have the ability to change. And we have changed the Constitution in 27 different ways. There are 27 total amendments in the Constitution, which have shown that in a way, the Constitution is not frozen. It can move and change with times if need be. And that's important. So some things, we can think of right away. Oh yeah, we know that's an important part of the Constitution. Other things we may have to think about, but when we think about them, we realize they're important too. Okay, could you come to the microphone, please?
Are there limitations incorporated into the Constitution? Define limitations with regard to our ability to be affected and to affect with it.
Mean citizens? Limitations on citizens or limitations on government?
Either.
Okay. The question was, are there limitations in the Constitution on the government or limitations on citizens? There are a number of very clear limitations on government, for example, all right? I'll be describing some of these in more detail, but the Bill of Rights itself is a list of limitations on the federal government, and later on those become limitations on the state governments as well. That is to say, notice, and I'll show this later on, the First Amendment is written, Congress shall make no law with respect to, and then rattles off a bunch of things. That says our speech, our religion, our religious preferences or lack thereof, speech, press, assembly shall not be limited. It's a limit on the government, not a limit on us. Okay. That the government, shall not infringe on ability of people to own guns, for example. And that's also a restraint on the government. So the Bill of Rights represents a sense of limitations on government. There are certain powers defined for the federal government, but also powers that are left to the states as well. So that's limitations on government. And when one thinks about it, the three independent branches of government, which provide checks and balances, that's also limitations, not so much as saying you can't do this specific thing, but it sets up a mechanism of limitations. If Congress were to pass laws that exceed their authority, they can be vetoed or struck down as unconstitutional by the courts. Or if a president exceeds his or her authority, for example, they could be checked by the Congress or the Supreme Court. That's another feature of limitations. The Constitution actually, in developing a government that was more powerful, a federal government that was more powerful than what we had under the Articles of Confederation, was designed in mind with this idea that we shouldn't make it so powerful that it becomes tyrannical. So definite limits on government were put into the Constitution. Now, another part of the question was, are there limits on the Constitution on citizens? Not explicitly, okay? But the way we interpret the Constitution and how far our rights go depends on how far our laws, how far we interpret the law to say that we have freedoms to do things. And when I talk about freedom of speech, I'll come up with examples of that there are limitations on citizens, but they're not necessarily written into the Constitution necessarily, but they're written into the way we've interpreted the law over time. All right. Now, this is a good list of what we have of essentials of the Constitution. I'm also going to add two more things. Next to due process of law, I'm going to add and the equal protection of the laws. I've had people, tell me, well, it's in the Constitution, right, that all men are created equal. Almost, not quite. That's not in the Constitution, that's in the Declaration of Independence, all right? So when we break away from Britain and we explain the reasons we're breaking away from the British Empire, we incorporate into the rationale that all people are created equal and that are born with rights. But equality under law doesn't actually get into the Constitution until later. And then it becomes an essential feature of the Constitution. It's part of the 14th Amendment, and the 14th Amendment has been the subject of more court cases in the federal courts than any other amendment, even the First Amendment, it turns out. And so much of what we're wrestling with in the news today, when you think about it, has to do with these questions about what it means to have equal protection under the laws. There is also in the Constitution a series of amendments that talk about voting rights. And these two become crucial because when it comes to selection of leaders, then these questions of who has voting rights and how the voting works and what the Constitution says about it and what other laws say about it become critically important to how we operate in the politics of our country. But you guys came up with a good list. Let me expand on some themes and talk about how the Constitution is something we're still wrestling with in many ways today, especially in the news. So used to my old computer. Interestingly enough, when I start talking about the Constitution, I know, like I said before, I've done this exercise with a number of people, and they want to start off talking about civil liberties, our freedoms to do things. Of course, that's important in the Constitution. For a lot of people, that's what defines who we are as Americans, is our freedoms. And a lot of people want to talk about checks and balances. I'm going to pose to you an interesting thought, that when the founders came together in Philadelphia in 1787 to negotiate a new constitution, the thing that was uppermost in their minds, excuse me, things that were uppermost in their minds. I don't have COVID-19 or a sore throat, by the way. It's more a question. I forgot to bring water with me. I'll get that during the break. So I'm wrestling with dry throat already, excuse me. Now, the thing that was uppermost, I would argue, in the founders' minds is this question of federalism. The fact that we divide power, governing power in this country, between different layers of government, not three branches of legislative, executive, and judicial. But what they wrestled with was this question of how much power to give the federal government and what power would the states keep. Please understand something about what was going on with the discussion of the Constitution. On the one hand, civil liberties was not the first thing they discussed among themselves. Remember, that's the First Amendment to the Constitution. So they meet in Philadelphia. They come up with 7 articles to form a new constitution. And it's only after they leave Philadelphia that they start thinking, wait, we should have added something. We've got people telling us they're not even interested in voting in favor of this constitution because there's no guaranteed rights in it. But that's a discussion that comes after they meet in Philadelphia. And yes, they talk about checks and balances while they're in Philadelphia. That's Madison's idea. And he presents it first thing when they start talking among themselves in Philadelphia. But before they go, the question that's arising in them is that the Articles of Confederation set up what is in effect a kind of loose association of the 13 original states. It's, I think, believe actually discussed in the Articles of Confederation that the different states will form a league of friendship, is the way it's phrased there. But this league of friendship was so loose of an association that the federal government could not raise its own military. The federal government could not, the Congress in the old national government under the Articles of Confederation could not raise its own taxes to pay for its own programs. And we were facing at the time a couple of threats. Number one was something called Shays' Rebellion. There was a rebellion that broke out among farmers. Oh, thank you so much. You're within 6 feet, but I'll forgive you. There was a revolt of farmers in Massachusetts called Shays' Rebellion over questions of taxes and being paid for the revolution. And the governor of Massachusetts actually called for help to help put down this rebellion and found no other states, and the Congress at the time under the Articles could not send any troops, and other states were not willing to help out. And the governor eventually, was able to calm things down. But there was this question about how many other riots might break out across the country. And second, remember at the time, the United States was not the superpower militarily that it is today. Obviously, if the Congress and the Articles could not raise its own army, there was no way we could be one of the great powers. Meanwhile, we have the British still in North America, to our north in Canada. We have the Spanish Empire to our south in Florida. And we have the French Empire in the Midwest. We don't always think about it here in Kansas, but at one time this was French land that we were sitting on. We bought it from the French in the Louisiana Purchase. But in 1787, the founders looked around and thought of themselves as, frankly, surrounded. 13 squabbling states, not very united as United States, being surrounded by different major powers of the time, and not sure that even though they won the revolution, that they could remain united and defending themselves against others around them. So they get to Philadelphia. The founders get to Philadelphia, and they're concerned with this question. We need to at least give up the Congress, as we mentioned before, new powers, stronger powers. To give the Congress stronger powers. And on the one hand, you have some founders like Madison and Hamilton very keen on the idea of making the federal government much stronger, to provide much more unity among the states, to provide for national defense, to provide for a number of other things. Hamilton, for example, later on becomes very concerned with paying off the debts that we had developed during the Revolution. We don't think about this much today, but it inspires a very famous musical. And it also became, it was actually at the time a very big political question for the United States, is how to deal with the finances of the United States. So there are all these questions going on, and not necessarily a Congress designed to do it. Madison, Hamilton, and others saying we need a stronger federal government to deal with a lot of these problems. Meanwhile, who is sending all of these people to the convention in Philadelphia? These guys represent the different states. Madison, for example, is part of the Virginia delegation. Hamilton is part of the New York delegation. Other people, other founders that are at this delegation know that states have sent them, and they owe something to the state legislatures that sent them. Especially, they don't want to give away the farm. They don't, these state legislators do not necessarily send these people to Philadelphia just to give all the power over to the federal government. So there is a lot of squabbling right at the beginning about how much power to grant the new federal government. And in effect, what the founders do, because they really disagreed among themselves more than we sometimes give them credit for. So many times we talk about the founders believe this, the founders believe that. They weren't all of one mind any more than we are today. What they did is they compromised. They set up a national level government that had more powers than it did under the old Articles of Confederation. But in doing so, and to make it palatable, especially to those focused more on the state's powers and the state's rights, Madison said, we're going to create a national government that's limited, like you were talking about, limited in so many ways, particularly with, and he presents this idea of checks and balances. We'll have a national level government. Yes, it'll have a Congress like before, but we'll add to it an executive branch to carry out those laws and get things done, make sure things get done, but it can block the Congress with a veto in case the Congress passes laws that shouldn't be passed. And we'll have a court system as well to decide on cases of federal law, again, to get things done. But it can, this is not actually written explicitly in the Constitution, but if later on during the Jefferson administration, it gets established that the Supreme Court can actually declare laws unconstitutional and can block what the Congress or the president does, for example. Checks and balances, in a way, is not just a way of protecting our liberties, which is something of big concern of the time, big concern at the time. It doesn't just protect the liberties of individual people, but it also protects the states, in effect, from a powerful federal government that can try and take all power away from them. That's in part what the founders compromised on. So what they do, and you can finally see this in what I've got up for you on the screens, and what you've got in your handouts, is that in Article 1, the Constitution is made up, if I didn't make it clear, of articles and amendments. The articles are the main body of the Constitution, and that's what those 7 articles are what they negotiated in Philadelphia in 1787. In Article 1, they list out 17 what are called enumerated powers, things that the Congress can do. It can raise taxes. It can raise a military. It can coin money. At the time in 1787, we had 13 different states all issuing their own currency. Imagine a Kansas currency that you would have to exchange for Nebraska currency if you went across the state border. That kind of thing was actually happening before we had a constitution. The Congress can actually lay out rights for intellectual property, for example, and it lays out a bunch of things. And the last one is a kind of a kicker. It says that Congress can also pass laws that are quote unquote necessary and proper for carrying out the duties of the other powers listed for them. Well, what's necessary and proper? This gives the Congress, well, that becomes something to be, that becomes a kind of elastic, deliberately vague language that gives the Congress some wiggle room to say, look, even if it's not explicitly there in the Constitution that we can pass laws about this, as long as we can make a case that it's related, we can pass these laws. And those are the implied powers of the Congress. Article 6 of the Constitution gets at what that gentleman in the purple shirt on my left was getting at earlier when talking about the federal government can actually trump the states. In effect, that to prevent squabbling among the different states, the federal laws would have precedence legally over state laws. And this has become known as the Supremacy Clause in the Constitution. So all of these first 3 points, the enumerated powers, the implied powers, and the Supremacy Clause, what these things do is that they give the federal government a certain amount of strength and power to unify the country, to provide for collective action on things that we all deal with, being Americans. It gives them the power to knock some heads together when states are squabbling with each other, and it allows for a different patchwork of state laws to have some foundation of unity among them. It also gives the federal government some real teeth to do things like defend the country and operate a smoothly working national economy in the process. But in granting the federal government so many extra powers that it never had under the Articles of Confederation, later on, part of what it takes to get the Constitution adopted is, as we said, a Bill of Rights. Certain leaders of state governments look at what they see in the Constitution and says, we don't see where we're protecting not only individual liberty, but we're protecting our rights as states to pass our own laws, raise our own taxes, to do things our way. So in the 10th Amendment, to make it clear and to help with the passage and the ratification of the Constitution, Amendment 10 says, Amendment 10, 10th Amendment of the Constitution states that whatever powers are not given to the federal government are in effect reserved for the states. So notice there are a number of things that aren't on that list of enumerated powers. The fact that our schools start classes at a certain time. My son just started his first day of school yesterday. He goes to Wichita Public Schools, Brooks Middle School, for example. It's the state of Kansas that determines when those schools open and when they close, what they teach. Most of you drove here. Many of you drove here to get here, or somebody drove you here, you need a license. Who issues that? It's the state of Kansas, for example. Getting married, getting divorced, that's not up to the federal government. Those are laws largely defined by the state of Kansas. You want a license to be a doctor or a lawyer. You want to cut hair. All of those things are certified by the state of Kansas, for example. A lot of things that are not explicitly in the Constitution as powers about how government runs our lives are often given to the states. And I often tell my students, one of the things that's kind of a little tragic about the way I teach these courses, and the way a lot of us teach these courses, is that we end up so focused on national politics, we often forget that a lot of politics that involves where we actually live our lives on a day-to-day basis, our schools, our marriages, our business operations, those are actually grounded in state and local laws, for example, rather than federal law. And we spend so much time sometimes, especially on the news or in classes like this, talking about what's going on at that highest level. We sometimes miss the really interesting stories that are going on at the lower levels, where actually a lot of action is. Case in point, a couple of things, and this comes up, this has been coming up in the news quite a lot, if you think about it. This is how odd and strange I can be when I think about things. When I'm listening to news about the pandemic, for example, I thought to myself, this is a really good, interesting teaching lesson about federalism for people, because we're sitting here wearing masks, or you guys are. I would be if I was sitting where you are. We're sitting here wearing masks. We're sitting here, sitting far apart. Who made a lot of these decisions? Well, obviously, the university administration made those decisions about what we need to do and how we behave in these rooms, to be sure. But where does the administration, get its guidelines from? Well, now we're starting to get into another question. The mask order for the mask order for Wichita, my wife just told me today, has been extended into October, and it was city government that ultimately decided that. The first lockdown orders never came from the federal government. And the first lockdown orders didn't come for us from the state of Kansas. They came from the county, Sedgwick County, for example. Then later on, there was a lockdown order for the state of Kansas. Notice how so many things that went on in terms of deciding things about the pandemic, about public health, were really state and local decisions. That does beg a question. Where does the federal government come in? It came in There is a Centers for Disease Control, the famous CDC, that gives guidelines. But notice how that's phrased, guidelines. CDC does not have the power to make laws about what we do with public health. They knew the courts would say, hey, that's a matter for state and local governments. It's reserved powers for them. But the CDC could try to coordinate activities, give what some of the best medical research would be as guidance for all the states and all the localities. That's a role for the federal government to try and unify the country. But the actual powers of, say, lockdown, mask wearing, these sort of ordinances are really vested more in the state and local governments. But we now have a politics, for example, where so many decisions and so many policies are, when you really look at it, mixtures of what the state and local governments have provided, what the federal government has provided, that it's sometimes hard to disentangle. For the founders, it tended to be more clear. National government does this, state governments do that. But as time has gone on, things have overlapped, all right? Wichita State University is run ultimately by the Board of Regents, which is a state level board. But when you talk about where did the money come from, for a building like this, or for some of the research that we're doing at Wichita State University, yes, I know it comes from tuition. I know a lot, I know you and a lot of my students have, paid for a lot of that, but there's also federal grant money that has also come in, that has also supplied, a lot of the money for financing operations. And back in 2009, 2010, federal stimulus money was something that WSU received to keep operating through that recession back then. Federalism even comes up when concerned with matters about the protests over how African Americans are treated. Because a lot of the big questions involve what? It has to do with police activity. And of course, we now have nationwide protests saying that we need to change systems of how African Americans are treated. But one key question that comes in here is, well, who's going to respond to that? If things need to change, who needs to change? People will often look to the president for leadership. But think about it, the police respond directly to whom? It's not the president of the United States. It's not the president of the United States. It is local, it's local governments. And so mayors, various mayors and city council people have come under intense pressure to talk about how the police are going to operate in their particular city, for example. And there's, that brings up a question, though, if there's going to be a national level response, especially in an election year like this, where Trump and Biden are under pressure to respond and say something about how we're going to deal with these questions about how police behave, it brings up an interesting question about exactly what their role is. There should be, the argument for saying there's something, but defining exactly what that is when the direct powers over the police are really vested in state and local governments, that's a question that really needs some thought, some real thought, for example. Yes. Another question.
One thing, I want to remind us that the money that the federal government has, of course, is tax money.
Right.
Therefore, it's our money coming back to help us.
Right.
In all levels. That would be the first thing. But the other thing is that we have in a situation where we get mixed messages from our elected officials at the highest level, probably in the lowest level. People who want to intervene with the governors. We have the Trump saying the states have to do this, and then he tells the states what they have to do. And that's confusing to the voter. Has it always been like that?
Yes. The question was, well, there are 2 points. One was that the money that the federal government has is tax money. Obviously, we pay income taxes, for example. And what the government doesn't borrow, for example, comes from tax money, from payroll and income taxes, among other sources. So yes, it's ultimately our money that we're talking about. That's true. The question was, though, that with federalism, we have federal government leaders sometimes saying one thing, state and local government sometimes later saying something else, and that's mixed messages. Has that always been the case? Of course it has. When you think about it, when we set up different layers of government, federal, state, and local government, there's always been the potential, and there always has been, for mixed messages. During the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, you would have some state leaders of southern states saying one thing about we're going to keep segregating schools, and the federal government saying, no, you're not. And there were mixed messages back then. In a way, the system of federalism is almost set up to deliver mixed messages, because there's no guarantee that the sort of leaders we elect at the state level will come from the same ideological persuasion or party as the leaders at the federal level. There's necessarily, and leaders of the federal level, by necessity, only the president of the United States is the only person elected through a nationwide election. His or her point of view and his or her concerns are going to be different than that of a certain state or section of the country. It's inevitable there's going to be mixed messages. But I allow you to think of it this way, that in one way, federalism is kind of like checks and balances, where we try and prevent tyranny from having one person or one group of people make all the decisions for us through checks and balances by having 3 independent branches of government, allowing them to check each other. It's a way that works because it divides power so that no one can be tyrannical. But federalism works the same way. It divides power among different layers of government, not different branches of government, different layers of government, so that you don't have one group of people making all the decisions for us. The cost, so it protects our liberties in one sense, and it allows Kansas to do something from, say, Alabama or Idaho, and we can be different that way and be free to be different that way. But it also, the cost is there's always going to be mixed messages, and that's a necessary part of the system. Okay, and we have a follow-up question as well. That's all right. Like I said, I'd rather go through discussion than just
It's
lecture.
interesting. I have never heard that there is a requirement that those who are campaigning and would like to serve the public at whatever level of government are required to take a course in the Constitution, so that they even understand as much as what we're going to learn from you.
The question, well, it wasn't so much a question as an observation. Those who have elected office or those seeking elected office are not required to take a course in the Constitution. Presumably, they've all been through, some sort of high school curriculum where they've been required to learn about American history and politics. So at least there's some level of understanding there. But I've heard it said that when they've tried to give American elected officials the same test about Constitution, history, and civics that are given to people seeking naturalized citizens, the elected officials don't necessarily do any better than the average American citizen does, which is to say, not necessarily well. And while this woman is coming up, I will also say in my international relations class, I normally have my students go through a simulation where they break up into teams, form different countries, and they interact with each other to trade fictional resources. They can declare war on each other, try and solve a common environmental problem together, and they work out, international relations with each other. I've often thought to myself, I would really love to have presidential candidates take one of those simulations in public, and we can see how they would handle foreign policy in a simulated way before we give them the real powers of commander-in-chief and tariffs, etc. It's not going to happen, though.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
There is a course that the new freshman congressmen take, or I think they have the option, but I think they're encouraged to take. Several years ago, I got to spend 10 days at the John Kennedy School and study healthcare policy. And while I was there, T. Hart was there as a freshman. And he's there for like 5 or 6 days. His wife is invited. And my class, he was supposed to take a lot of what I was taking in healthcare. And then he was also supposed to branch out into other issues of government. And my class was 7 o'clock in the morning till 7 o'clock at night. And we had lunch speakers and dinner speakers. Like we had the governor of Hawaii come. And at that time, the governor of Hawaii was trying to get Mass General or Mayo Clinic to come to Hawaii and set up a hospital or a clinic because he wanted to stop the fairly new wealthy people from some of the islands off of Hawaii to stop into Hawaii and get their health care and all that instead of coming to the United States, so that Hawaii wouldn't be in such a deficit. And Hawaii, at that time, that governor promised health care to all. And he knew he could do that if he increased the income coming into the state. So it was interesting to hear him. But what happened was T-Hart, it was like 5 or 6 days. He came, but he would sit in classes and not truly take it serious. And that's what they say is a congressman come and they do it more for a political reason and a social reason. So they get to meet all of these people, these talking heads that we see on television. A lot of them were my teachers. And so what they do is they're more there for, they're not serious, or at least he was not serious. And he has his wife, and he'd attend like 1 or 2 classes, and then he'd go off and socialize and whatever. Now, my understanding is Harvard was considered the liberal. So most of Republicans didn't want to send their new freshmen to a liberal school because they'd get liberal aspect of the health problem, the health care problem. And this is like 90, when was I there? 90, 98, 97, when the healthcare was changing. We had the opportunity to change it from where it's at. And so there was a lot of discussion going on. So they will send, the Republicans will send to it their freshmen, if they want them educated, to more of a conservative school. So I'm not real sure. Maybe he attended both. I'm not sure at that time period. I didn't talk to him about that. But so say John Hopkins.
Okay.
Whereas the Democrats or people wanting to look at both sides would probably come to the John Kennedy School or to Harvard. So it was a really, really interesting insight to that. And the fact that he was only there for 5 days with his wife, socializing more so than really understanding the problems and the possible solutions. And I thought that was I was disappointed in that. And I even, when I had the opportunity to talk to him, because I had already attended 3 or 4 days and went, wow, this is fascinating. We got the budget, and we were able to look totally through the budget of that day, fresh off the press, and how much we would take from and fix the healthcare situation at that time period. And it was it was fun, but I was really disappointed. And so it really gave me an insight to how little our new freshman congressmen get, and how they're swayed by who's already in Congress. So I think that's an interesting thing that maybe should be looked at and changed.
To summarize, especially for those of you, I'm not sure how many of those of you online were able to hear. The lady had mentioned that she was not a congressperson herself, but she knows that Congress people, upon being a freshman, on being a first term representative or first term senator, they are given classes, and that is true. And she watched as one particular congressman, T-Hart, was to be at classes about healthcare policy. She felt he was not taking them seriously enough, but she learned a lot from them. I do know this. Freshman Congress people are given classes, especially the classes I think they tend to be given most critically, and the ones they're most interested in taking in are classes about congressional procedure. Because the Constitution does allow both the House and the Senate to come up with their own rules of procedure and operation. These, if you thought you learned Robert's Rules of Order sometime during your education, this goes well beyond this. The rules of parliamentary procedure in Congress are very arcane, and it does take classes to learn how they work. They're critical for how legislators work because the process determines the outcome, shall we say. And so without, sometimes the people who wield some of the most influence in Congress are those who know the procedures, the parliamentary procedures deeply, very well. And they know the finer points where it helps them strategize how to get bills through Congress or to block them in Congress, as often as the case may be. You were disappointed that the particular congressman you had exposure to was not necessarily taking the classes on healthcare policy seriously. It saddens me. I would like to think that congresspeople of both parties, whatever persuasions, would try and absorb as much information as possible. Congress does actually have a Congressional Research Service, an entire, a staff of over 100 some people, which can look up information about anything congresspeople want them to do research on, to provide background for them. They have a wealth of material at their disposal. But we ask congresspeople to have opinions on every issue under the sun, and it's hard to be an expert on everything. Please understand, though, and it's a new feature, it's a feature of, especially a new feature of how our politics works today, that when people are encouraged to run for office, a lot of people have the sense, I just think I'll run for office. I'll just, throw my hat into the ring and I'll decide to do that. And very frequently nowadays, party officials, people who are members of party organizations, will do a kind of headhunting. And they'll look at people who are strong conservatives, if they're Republicans, or strong liberals in the Democratic Party and say, I like your ideas. I like what you're saying. I think you ought to run for this seat. A lot of times, usually the people that are encouraged to run anymore have a lot of opinions already set for them before they even run. And you can decide for yourselves how right and wrong that is, but it is a very consistent feature of elections on both sides of the aisle today. Let's see. We are at 5 minutes to 2 o'clock. And it's probably a good time for a break at this point. I did want to talk about the First Amendment, but we had so much good free discussion and examples of free speech that I'm going to push this till after a break. How about we take a 10-minute break and we come back? My phone is telling me it's 1:57. How about we come back at 2:07 and I'll make some comments on civil liberties and civil rights, and also the role of our constitutional ideals in our politics, if I have time towards the end. I'll try and leave time for questions, though. All right. 2:07, please. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it is now 2:09, and here I say we'd be coming back at 2:07. So if people could take their seats, please. Just a couple of items before we start on other topics about the Constitution. Please remember that as part of a WSU facility, unless you're giving public presentations, you should be wearing a mask at all times. And we do strongly encourage mask wearing at all times. If somebody does have, somebody's just taking a quick sip for a drink, I mean, heaven knows I need water myself. And that's perfectly acceptable, but please put your mask back on. If you do have respiratory problems or some sort of medical ailment that, a mask would make things more difficult for you, we can understand that. But please make sure, not only to spread things to others, but not to expose yourself in such a facility where there's the possibility for so many germs to be circulating. Please do wear your mask as much as possible. We at WSU would appreciate it. I actually had many people, thankfully, come up to me during the break and talk to me. I do appreciate your feedback and comments, as I said. One person reminded me of something which other students of mine have also reminded me of. I was talking about driver's licenses and how that's a power of state governments, and that's true. It is Kansas, it is Idaho, it is Pennsylvania that issue the licenses, and a lot of the driving regulations and how you acquire a license, how you can lose a license, that's all defined by state governments. But this person reminded me that a federal law has now gone into effect, whereby if you use your driver's license for travel within the United States, you have to have a real ID. And that's because, what makes for a real ID, the regulations concerning that has been handed down from the federal government, for example. This is yet another example of something I did mention in my lecture, which was that the founders originally envisioned a division of power whereby the federal government would handle certain issues and the state governments would handle other issues. But as time has gone on, we've developed something called cooperative federalism. That is to say, the federal governments and the state governments end up contributing different things which end up forming the policies we deal with. And both the federal and state governments may have a hand in what actually results. And now driver's licenses are yet another example of where that cooperative federalism is at work. So I do want to thank that student for reminding me. I do want to spend some time talking. Now, obviously, federalism is not the only thing in the Constitution. There's plenty of other things to talk about. You've already, helped develop a list for that. One thing that often comes to mind for a number of people, especially when they think of the Constitution, for them, the Constitution embodies one word in particular. It embodies freedom. And when we talk about these freedoms, sometimes people will talk about their civil liberties and whether something is a civil liberties question. That's a bit more of a pompous term, but it's a term that's used in law. And people will sometimes say, well, if government does this, they're infringing on my civil rights. And very oftentimes when people use these terms in ordinary language, they'll use civil liberties and civil rights interchangeably. If you're a trained lawyer, they tell you not to do that. Okay, because actually, as a matter of law, as a point of law, civil liberties and civil rights are actually two different things, representing two different values or ideals that we hold dear that are both in the Constitution. Civil liberties, strictly speaking, are the points about freedom and guarantees for individual freedom that are guaranteed to us in the Bill of Rights, those first 10 amendments of the Constitution. And so, strictly speaking, when we talk about things like free speech, gun ownership, how you're prosecuted during a crime, what rights you have if you're subject to criminal prosecution, those are the meat and substance of things involving civil liberties, for example. But civil rights is technically different. Civil rights really refers to the equality of people under law, and to the extent to which we can or should discriminate between people of different races, different genders, or people of different categories, and what it means for us to have equality under law for the Constitution to apply equally to all of us, those, strictly speaking, are questions of civil rights. And whereas the ideal and the value of freedom is really what's embodied in civil liberties, it's the value and ideal of equality of all peoples that's embodied in civil rights. And so technically, as a legal matter, those two terms are not supposed to be interchangeable. They really refer to different things. And just as with federalism, we've been going through a lot of material in the past couple of years where we see where the Constitution is really something we're still wrestling with today. Let me give you an example, and I will admit it is a touchy example. And while I was thinking about this lecture earlier on the past few days, I thought, should I really bring this up? And I'm going to do it anyway. Because if I thought to myself, if I don't bring it up, I'm almost guaranteed somebody will. Earlier this year, in February, WSU Tech was planning to have a commencement ceremony. And at the time, the pandemic hadn't quite fully hit the United States. We thought, commencement would go on pretty much as usual. And WSU Tech invited a luminary to come give a commencement speech at WSU Tech, one Ivanka Trump. I think you've all heard of Ivanka Trump. She's the daughter of our president, and the president has named her to a task force to work on improving technology and research in the United States. She was invited to give a commencement speech, to give one of many commencement speeches at WSU Tech, which, by the way, that's a separate college from the other colleges. For example, when I attend a graduation ceremony, it's for the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, which is run in a different way, and we ask different people to come and give our commencement ceremonies. But Ivanka Trump was asked to come originally in February, and then as it got closer to the time in June, a number of professors and students at Wichita State University argued this was a poor choice, and that in a time after George Floyd's death, for example, this sends a signal that maybe WSU Tech does not want to send to the world about where we stand on the struggle for equality and fairness in the United States. The decision was made, for example, to, in effect, tell Mrs. Trump, well, the decision was made, strictly speaking, that she could still give her address, and she did give a pre-recorded address, but hers would no longer be necessarily a commencement address. There would only be one speaker, a graduate of WSU Tech, who would give the commencement speech for everyone. And that if students wanted to, they could hear other messages from other speakers. Ivanka Trump would be one of them. Firestorm. Understandably. And Ivanka Trump got on Instagram and Twitter, for example, arguing about something called cancel culture, using a term that's now become only more popular in the past few years. That various liberal students have essentially canceled her involvement in the university and in the university graduation ceremonies because of her points of view, for example, and saying that she had been deplatformed, another term that has only come into being just in the past few years. Some people argued, of course, this was controversial argument. She argued, and many conservatives argued, that she was in effect being deprived of free speech. So a debate ensued. What does the Constitution say? What does it say? There's a text for you up there on the screens to either side of it. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Was she denied her freedom of speech? Somebody may argue, well, look at the text of it out there. It says, Congress shall make no law regarding freedom of speech. And in that sense, no, it wasn't Congress that made this decision, so we're not talking about censorship here. Strictly speaking, that's not a good legal argument, because Wichita State, as we said, this is a this is a publicly owned university. It is, an agency. It is, it is under the laws and under the direction of the state of Kansas. And the 14th Amendment does go on to say that no state shall make laws, abridging the freedoms guaranteed in the American Constitution. So the state of Kansas is bound and restrained by the Bill of Rights, just like the federal government is. Can't make that argument that this only applies to Congress. The real legal argument, what really seems to turn on here, if the Trumps were to try and take Wichita State to court, arguably they may not have a case. And I am not, by the way, a trained lawyer. I have a PhD, not a JD. My understanding is this: she was still given a chance and a platform to speak. She was given, her address was still allowed to be given. She was just not one that all students were required to hear. But her speech was not blocked from being given to the students. If students wanted to click on her message, they could still see it. In that sense, her freedom of speech was still given to her. All right. As a legal matter, and I know I could be in hot water here because I'm not a trained lawyer, and yes, I'm an employee at WSU. Maybe I have feelings about this. I could accept those criticisms. But as far as I understand the law, her freedom of speech, strictly speaking, was not necessarily abridged in this particular case. What matters here, I think, is not so much that there is a legal issue. She wasn't necessarily deprived of freedom of speech. And for a person who got on Instagram and Twitter and was able to speak her mind about what she thought about being disinvited, no, she wasn't necessarily, being restrained from speaking her mind. But what's here is not so much a legal matter as it is a political matter. There is another question here, admittedly, about the role of who gets to speak and who is valued. Because we do live in times in society now where especially conservatives in particular wonder if their views and if their speech is valued by others. And this is where we get these concerns about, say, cancel culture and deplatforming at universities. Admittedly, universities at times have looked to tell people, no, you're not going to be given this platform to speak. You're not going to be invited to speak here, for example. And people of a variety of different persuasions have been denied platform, or been told, or student groups have been told, please do not invite that person. And that's true, that's sometimes happened. But conservatives have wondered if they're the ones who are the brunt of this more than others. And what we're really dealing with here is not necessarily so much a legal matter, was she deprived of her right to speak, but are she and other conservatives really valued at the university the same way that, say, other points of view are? And that's a more political matter that has come up in our times. The reason I bring this up at the point of getting a lot of people lining up and wanting to give me what for about this whole episode is that it brings up questions about us. I had another question that come up during the break about Second Amendment, and the lady told me, well, that applies to having a well-regulated militia. Why should anyone just be allowed to buy guns? Because the Second Amendment doesn't literally say that. When we address questions of civil liberties, part of what we're wrestling with is the sheer words of the text, which when you look at them, you could read them easily in a few minutes. The words themselves tend to be, very few and spare. There's not necessarily a lot of elaboration there. But what we wrestle with is, how are we going to apply those few words to us today? Not just as a legal matter, but in our culture. Are we really giving everyone a right to speak their mind? So conservatives wonder, understandably, whether or not their views are going to be heard in college classes as much as, say, liberals are. And protesters out on the streets in various cities have been wondering, when police are telling them to cease and desist or to get back, are their rights to speak being valued? And are their rights being infringed by those actions? We're wrestling with these things a lot today. I can take questions, but I can't necessarily answer all questions for you, but I can go over some things about where the questions of interpretation really start to hit the road. The First Amendment, like so many civil liberties, we're allowed to do many things under the Constitution, worship or not worship as we please, own guns, have a certain right to privacy, speak our mind, publish certain number of things, where there's all kinds of, form different groups, for example, or come to talk about things in common. We're allowed all kinds of freedoms. And yet, when these matters come up as court cases, when is somebody's civil liberties infringed, the things we often weigh on different sides are, how much does the Constitution give a person a right to say or do this versus some sort of compelling public interest in trying to restrain people from going too far with what they do. Courts, federal courts and state courts, when you ask them questions about, well, don't I have the right to say anything or anything that I want? Literally speaking, not anything. The rights under the Constitution are not meant to be quote unquote absolute, and courts have not interpreted them that way. This goes back a long ways, actually. One of the cases that came up as a legal matter was something called Schneck versus the United States. And Schneck was a member of either a socialist party or a communist party back around the time of World War I. This was at a time when radical movements like socialism and communism were gaining steam and gaining adherents. Back around the time of the early 1900s, they were gaining a lot of steam. It was around the same time people were starting to organize trade unions, for example. A lot of concerns about how the rich treated the poor, whether or not working class people could organize for their interests, for example. Schneck, being one of the more radical features of, one of the more radical members of this movement, was speaking during World War I how people should avoid the draft, for example, and in fact, what we should do is not fighting the Germans, but we should take the fight to our current leaders and overthrow the government. And he was advocating even violent revolution to overthrow what he saw as a corrupt system. He was very predictably thrown in jail for making speeches like this. Schneck took his case to the courts, the federal courts, and said, look, when they threw me in jail, they violated my rights to free speech. And so the question came before the Supreme Court, eventually worked its way up to the Supreme Court. Did he have the right to say what he did? In this particular case, the court actually said, with a majority vote, no, he did not. And the crucial distinction was this. Said one Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, even the most broadest interpretation of free speech would not accept someone presenting a what quote unquote a clear and present danger to the public, for example. And that what was worrying to the Supreme Court members at the time, most of the Supreme Court members at the time, is that he was not simply speaking his mind on politics, but he was advocating violent revolution. That is to say, he was telling people to go out and kill other people. And what he argued was not even, what Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes argued in this particular case was not even the most elastic or broader interpretation of the First Amendment would allow a person to yell fire in a crowded theater when there was no such fire, just to deliberately cause a deliberate panic where people could get injured, for example. So, there were limits, especially with Schneck versus the United States. There were limits drawn on free speech, but the limits are very defined in American law. You cannot present what is called a clear and present danger to the physical safety of other people. You can't use your speech, for example, to plot crimes. You can't plot a murder, get arrested, and then say, well, free speech, right? No, courts aren't going to buy that for you. You can't conspire to commit crimes. You can't use your speech to advocate violence, for example. There are limits to what you do. Over time, though, the courts started siding with more and more people arguing that they should be able to say unpopular things. Should movies be allowed to show a little more skin, say a few words that in older times were regulated out of the existence of Hollywood movies? Courts increasingly said, yes, they should be allowed to do so. All right. And at one time, there used to be something called the Hayes Office, which actually had active censorship of Hollywood movies. And during the 1930s and 40s, some of the movies you and I may have grown up with, some of the older movies you and I may have grown up with, we're familiar with the fact that, certain words were not said. When people started kissing each other, the screen would start to go dark. They'd move on to the next scene. We got used to the fact there were certain things they didn't show. And starting around the 1960s, the court started saying that office shouldn't exist to regulate what Hollywood producers could put out. And so instead, we now have a movie rating system whereby the motion picture industry put, slap certain letters, G, PG, or R, onto movies to kind of regulate themselves, because courts said Congress and the federal government shouldn't be doing that kind of regulation, even though movies are interstate commerce. That's the way it was originally justified. No, the court said these are forms of art, and you should be allowed to say, to depict ideas, to give artistic representations, a more wider field. In 1989, I can remember it because I was working as an intern in a congressional office, the court came down with a narrow 5-4 decision, stating that if a person burns an American flag as an act of protest, this counts as symbolic speech, even though it's an action. And one young man named Johnson did this as a protest against American foreign policy. It was said, even though this was an action, he wasn't saying anything. He did do something which was deeply offensive to a number of Americans. It was offensive to the congressman I was working for. Nevertheless, the court said, no, that is still a symbolic act which is meant to present a political idea, and that should not be restrained. Now, if I set this flag on fire and I start using it as a weapon against some of you, no, not allowed. Some things are still not allowed. You can't print, for example, national security secrets. You can't, national security secrets about military operations that would divulge secrets to the enemy. The government can actually engage in what's called prior restraint to prevent the publication of national security secrets. Or if journalists find out secrets that are supposed to be sealed in court documents, courts can actually say, no, journalists can be fined or go to jail for revealing secrets about court cases that are supposed to be sealed. There can be restraint in those actions. There are libel laws and slander laws, for example, where the person who feels that they have been lied about to ruin their reputation can bring suit against the person who is lying about them, but the burden of proof is on the person bringing the suit, for example. So can you say literally or do anything? No, not exactly. But we have a number of court cases that have built up over the years, which trying to find boundaries for exactly, exactly where does the rights of free speech and free press stop, and where does a public interest in public safety or national security actually take some precedence. And part of what we deal with in trying to wrestle with our civil liberties in this culture is trying to define those boundary lines of exactly how far those go. It's true that in recent times that boundary has been moving in greater and greater ways in terms of having more speech and people speaking their mind about more and more things that used to be taboo. But some boundary lines do exist. Also, I do want to raise attention of questions about equality under law, about civil rights, another important part of the Constitution. Gentleman in the middle talked about due process. What exactly is due process? We actually get this from the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. There's also words, now that I think about it, in the 5th Amendment about due process. But much of what we have to do, much of what we understand about how we're supposed to be treated equally under law comes from two clauses in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Due process clause states, quote, "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." And then follows closely after that something called the Equal Protection Clause. And the subject here is still the states, "Nor shall any states deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." Legalese. What are we talking about here? Notice that this is the 14th Amendment. This comes in well after the Bill of Rights have already been established. The first 10 amendments are set up in the Constitution very shortly after the Constitution is ratified. We have two other amendments, the 11th and the 12th Amendment, to deal with some other matters, particularly concerning the Electoral College and elections in one of those amendments. And then for a long time in our history, we have no other changes to the Constitution. And then with And then, of course, we know the big rupture in the early 1860s, Civil War. The country nearly tears itself apart and very nearly does not survive as United States, tearing itself over the question of slavery and whether or not states actually have the right to break away from the United States. So notice here an important, the way the 14th Amendment is phrased. Well, prior to the 14th Amendment, during Lincoln's administration, we passed the 13th Amendment. It abolishes slavery all throughout the United States. It used to be under the original Constitution, some states would be allowed to choose if they wanted to have slavery, and some states could choose to be free. We know from our history, a lot of those states that chose slavery were in the South. A lot of those states that chose to have no slavery were in the North. But the question came up, can states secede from the Union because they don't like the changes they see coming down the pike about slavery? The answer ultimately was no, they could not secede from the Union. So with the 13th Amendment, there is a kind of shift, when you think about it, of power to the national governments. One power the states used to have, the power to determine if they have slaves, if their slaves could be owned or not, was taken away from all the states from the 13th Amendment. Notice how the 14th Amendment is phrased. When I showed you the First Amendment, it said, Congress shall make no law concerning an establishment of religion, prohibiting free exercise thereof. Congress shall not restrict Congress shall not restrict access to guns. Congress shall not do this. Congress shall not usurp powers that are given to the states. The subject is always Congress and, by extension, how the federal government operates. And there are limitations. I had that question about limitations earlier. The limitations are directly on the federal government. Notice here, the restrictions are really meant for the states. What's the underlying concern here? It's not that the federal government necessarily may deprive citizens, well, there are concerns that the federal government may deprive citizens of equality under law, but who are we really concerned about? That after the Civil War is over, we bring these southern states back in, and instead of instituting slavery, what are they going to do? They're going to try and make their African-American citizens now second-class citizens. The 14th Amendment is deliberately designed to prevent that from happening. I don't have it up here, but the very first thing the 14th Amendment talks about is, interestingly enough, citizenship. The 14th Amendment says anyone who is born in the United States or naturalized under congressional law is a citizen of the United States. Sounds very ordinary. It sounds very ordinary language, but notice the political implications. That even if we're going to do away with slavery, the southern states can't come along later once they're reincorporated into the Union and say, well, we're not giving these people the same rights or the same procedures in the law as our white citizens. They're not really citizens. They weren't born that way, so we don't have any legal obligation to do that. 14th Amendment takes the power of the southern state governments in particular away from saying you can't call them not citizens anymore. They were born here. We're going to count them as citizens now. So, can't get away with that citizenship dodge. And to tie the states further, you can't deprive them of due process of law. You can't write the laws in such a way that you treat the citizens differently. You can't write laws saying we're going to have one set of rules and regulations for white people, but a different set of rules and regulations for African Americans. Can't do that anymore. The states are effectively restrained, but by extension, also the federal government as well. This is an interesting development in American political history, because even with the Declaration of Independence, for example, we have written into our reasons for instituting an American Revolution that all men are created equal and that they're all given rights. We say that in the Declaration, but when the Constitution comes along, interestingly enough, if you look at those seven articles and you look at the Bill of Rights, the word equal is actually not there anywhere in the text. The word equal only shows up for the first time in the 14th Amendment. And this installation of that old ideal in the Declaration of Independence of everyone is equal in their rights, that really only becomes vested in the Constitution starting with this amendment after the Civil War is over. And one documentary I saw on PBS about the Constitution noted an interesting thing. It said that a lot of subsequent American history after the Constitution is developed has a lot to do with incorporating more and more people into we the people. It comes part of that incorporation of saying that all people born here, we're all citizens, we all have equality under law. That's a development that comes in the midway through our political history, and it's also shown up in how this Constitution treats voting as well. A lot of people, if I may make a point, I'll get to your question, sir. A lot of people, if they think of the Constitution, think, well, we have rights to free speech, we have rights, we have rights to this and that, to rights to assemble, rights against, unfair processes to criminal prosecution. The right to vote must be there in the Constitution itself. It must say somewhere in the Bill of Rights you have the right to vote, right? That's actually not in the Bill of Rights. What the Constitution actually originally says is it doesn't have an explicit guarantee of a right to vote for all citizens explicitly written in there as such. What the Constitution does allow, really, is to allow the states to define how voting works in their particular state. This is another federalism question. And that's why, if you think about it, when we have this discussion, a lot of people nowadays are very concerned. Well, how are we going to operate the voting when it comes election time later in November? Are we going to vote by mail? Are we going to have to show up at a polling place? Who's going to ensure that those votes are all counted and that they're all safe? The federal government can make some regulations about this, but a lot of the actual rules about voting are really left up to the states and the counties. It's the states and the counties that decide if you're allowed to vote by mail or not. Some states have been doing vote by mail, it turns out, for some time. Other states, now that we have a pandemic going on, are starting to think about how we introduce this for the first time, but those state administrations are going to have to get ready really soon to make sure that vote by mail works, if it's going to operate that way in the state. What this means, though, is that a lot of states and counties also, when you think about it, they're the ones who determine how you vote. Are you going to use a machine, or are you going to use a paper ballot? Are you going to walk up to a computer screen and tap to do your voting? Or do you just fill out a piece of paper? I grew up in Pennsylvania, for example. And I remember these voting machines where you walked into a booth, you pulled a lever, this curtain came behind you, and then you tapped different levers. I didn't do it. My parents let me in the booth, and I got to see them, turn the different levers, and that's how we voted. It was only when I grew up and older I realized not everyone in the country actually did it that way, because different states have different rules. Different states do actually have different rules about voting rights. And the big difference here in a lot of cases is convicted felons. In some states, everybody has the right to vote, even if you're in jail. And now with the pandemic going on, there's a question about how you operate a system like that when some people are in jail. But up until recently, Florida told its convicted felons, you don't have a right to vote. Once you commit a crime and you've been sentenced, you've lost your voting privileges after that. And for a number of Americans, that only makes sense, and that's a proper punishment. Other people think that's a violation of our principles, even if it's not a violation of the letter of the law, for example. Different states can have different rules about that. Needless to say, and I go back to the Constitution, with states having, frankly, a lot of power to define how voting rights work, we had to have another amendment in the Constitution, the 15th Amendment, to tell the states you can't deny people the right to vote just because they're of a certain race. Again, it comes out of the Civil War and the concern that Southern states in particular would deny the right to vote to those who are now our African-American citizens. That, of course, allowed African-American males to vote, at least officially. Granted, yes, I do know the way the Southerners wrote their laws, they found clever ways to figure out other ways to deny African-Americans the right to vote. Poll taxes, literacy tests, still went on. Violation of the principles of the 15th Amendment, but voting rights were extended. And after that, of course, and now, we're trying to remind ourselves when we're not listening to news about, say, pandemic and protests. Hold on a second. We're being reminded today, this year's an anniversary, of course. It's the anniversary of the 19th Amendment. Women were given the right to vote across the country. It used to be Wyoming gave their women the right to vote before this happened, and other states did that, but it was only nationally mandated that all states had to do this with the 19th Amendment, and that's effectively what we've been celebrating 100 years of today. That extended the vote more than any other single act in the United States. Paying poll taxes were finally done away with the 24th Amendment, and after the Vietnam War, we passed the 26th Amendment on the grounds that if you can fight and die for your country, because you were drafted to do so, you ought to be able to vote as well if you reach 18 years of age. Now, I've just remembered, you, ma'am, you had your hand up, but this gentleman had his hand up way before, so I'm going to take some questions now. Sir, can you get over here so we can all hear you? Or the big sponsors were what we would now call a group of men called the Radical Republicans, okay? And that sounds interesting to modern ears today. But remember, the Republican and Democratic parties had very different platforms and appealed for very different kinds of voters during the Civil War and in the lead up to it. The Democratic Party, way back when in the early 1800s, was trying to appeal both to Northern and Southern votes. And the Democratic Party was in many ways split on the question of slavery and didn't necessarily want to tell the Southern states you couldn't have slavery. The Republican Party formed out of a kind of a merger of the old Whig Party, W-H-I-G, people who didn't like Andrew Jackson and the dominance of the old Democratic Party, and some pro-slavery activists who thought that we needed to get rid of slavery in the country. They merged together, the Whig faction and the abolitionist faction kind of merged together to form a new Republican Party. And while the war was going on, Lincoln is saying, well, the rebellion of the South is illegal because they're disassociating from the Union. And at first, Lincoln didn't even really say, even though he was a Republican, he didn't really say, we're doing this to abolish slavery. We're not fighting the war to abolish slavery. We're doing this to preserve the Union. It was radical Republicans and men like Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave, who argued saying, you need to start pushing anti-slavery as the key reason that we're fighting this war. So they pushed him, and when Lincoln thought the timing was right, pushed the 13th Amendment. After Lincoln died, the Congress was largely made up overwhelming of Republicans, and the radical Republican faction, that more abolitionist faction, really pushed this agenda about trying to make sure that we not only got rid of slavery, but also, the sort of stain that it had for our principles. And they were the ones who really pushed it. Making sure that the Republican majorities in Congress wouldn't operate until they got what they wanted here, for example. So that's who was largely responsible for it. Ma'am, way in the back, you had your hand up. Would you be able to come up here? It would be a lot easier for me to hear you as well as everyone else. Ma'am, if she could, she had her hand up before, so I'll take her question and then I'll take yours. Okay.
I just recently found out that 15th Amendment included male African Americans to vote,
Right.
but did not include the Native Americans, which they were the original citizens of this country.
Mhm.
So how did
That is true.
they did not get included in that?
No, they were not. Native Americans were considered a distinct racial category and only given voting rights through an act of Congress in the early 20th century, it turns out. So they had to wait a much longer time. And that was partly because there were questions, they did have questions of citizenship and whether, incorporation, because technically under the treaties the United States government signed with them, they could be counted as separate nations. And unfortunately, this led to legal complications about how they were included.
But anybody that's born here on this land is a citizen.
Right, according to the 14th Amendment.
It's confusing to me.
It is confusing, but remember, part of what we're dealing with here is that the principles that were enshrined in the Constitution are one thing. The follow-through of government actually applying those principles was a whole different political question. And unfortunately, it didn't always live up to the principles put in there. Okay. Yes, ma'am. Sorry to make you wait.
When was the 24th Amendment passed?
That was in the 1960s. I want to say 1964, but it was part of the civil rights, the modern civil rights movement.
Because I'm originally from Texas and we had poll tax,
Mhm.
and it conveniently prevented a lot of minorities
did.
from voting.
Right. Unfortunately, 24th Amendment was rather later in our history, and it was, to my knowledge, I want to say 1964. I'm not sure if I got that correct, but it was a much later addition to the Constitution. The woman in the back brings up an interesting point, actually delivers a nice kind of, and also the question we just had about poll taxes delivers a nice segue about something I wanted to end with in our time before we leave. And that has something to do with a book that I was required to read for my first course in American politics when I was a student at the University of Pittsburgh. I'm proud to say I was taking an honors version of that course, but what that meant in part was that I had to do a lot more reading than most of the other students. And a book, I was assigned, about 4 different books. I never do this to my students. I was assigned 4 different books for my first course in American politics. And one of them was a book by a Harvard scholar by the name of Samuel Huntington. And it was a book published in 1981 called American Politics, The Promise of Disharmony. And Huntington was trying to wrestle with the question that he had been posed when he was a student. What's the relation between political ideas and political institutions? As a student, he didn't feel he wrestled with it very well, but when he became a scholar himself, he wrote an entire book about it. And some of you have taken my course before, have heard me lecture on this, but not everyone's heard this before. What Huntington argues in his book is that American identity, our sense of American identity, really comes from a sense of beliefs. We obviously don't have, the French and the Japanese, for example, they can base their identity on a common ancestry and a common language. Well, you can look around the room and Americans cannot quite do that, really. Where does American identity come from? It comes from a set of ideals that are embodied in the Constitution. Huntington argues that in American political life, we have a set of beliefs that he calls an American creed. We've actually been talking about this American creed the entire 2-hour session. The American creed says our political life, our social life should be governed by certain ideals: freedom, equality under law, majority rule, a rugged individualism, self-government. These are things that serve not only as a sense of who we are as Americans, but what typifies us, what makes us maybe in some ways maybe different from other countries, and serves as maybe what's meant to be the guiding force. And that what the Constitution does is it embodies these ideals in American law, our foundational law, supreme law of the land, for example. Now, freedom, equality, all these beliefs, sometimes they can work in different ways. They can move us in different directions. Majority rule may say we should pass laws banning the burning of American flags, for example. But individual freedom may tell us, no, those people should be allowed to say those things we want, even if most people find that reprehensible. Equality, to some extent, implies that you're going to be treating everyone the same, especially the same under law. But if you give everyone their freedom, people are going to do different things, and people have to be treated differently. These ideals sometimes lead us to fights over a sense of priorities, what is actually most important to us. And at different times and for different people, different parts of the American creed have different sense of importance for us. But Huntington was struck by one thing about the American creed. He said that there's a common thread running through all these beliefs. He called it an anti-power ethic. That is to say, all of our core beliefs, he said, delegitimize or argue against concentrated political and economic power. If you're going to have freedom of individuals, it means that you can't have a small group of people telling everybody what to do. If there's going to be equality under law, a small group of people can't have all the power, and other people have much less. If we're going to have majority rule, a small aristocratic or wealthy elite can't necessarily get to decide the rules for us. The people need to have a role in selecting leaders and determining what laws we have. That there's an anti-power ethic, he said, that runs through a lot of our deepest beliefs that we try to enshrine in our Constitution. Meanwhile, Huntington was also what we call a political realist. By realist, with a small r, I mean, belongs to a school of thought that argues politics is often about the exercise of power. Power is often the currency of politics. To get things done, you need power. Politics is often about a contest for power. This group wins or that group wins. This group got to win the election, that group didn't. This group won its case in court, some other people lost. And that power is often politics is often a very intense game of who's having a contest for power, and that if you're going to run a legislature or a bureaucracy, you need power to get things done. Notice something else I said about the Constitution. In order to create the federal government, we had to vest it with more power than what we had before. If we're going to defend the country, if we're going to raise taxes for public programs, if we're going to even install a set of laws about intellectual property, we need somebody with the power to enforce all those things. That means accumulating power. That means concentrating. Different people are going to want to concentrate power. And for Huntington, this is just the normal life of American politics. What he argues is that these two things, the American creed with its beliefs in freedom and equality and majority rule, and our political institutions, which require power to operate and which attract people to try and acquire more power, they exist in a tension with one another. There's always this gap, he said, between, and it's illustrated in what we've been talking about. There's this gap between our principles. Everyone should have the right to vote. Everyone should have the right to vote. Everyone who's born here and naturalized as a citizen should be equal citizens under law. And yet there's a gap between that and, unfortunately, the practice of our politics. In our history, let's face it, there were poll taxes, which barred a lot of people from voting. Native Americans were not necessarily granted the same rights as everybody else, even though they were born here. Various people may feel they are denied the right to speak, even though that First Amendment has been there since the early founding of our republic, for example. We wrestle with this all the time. And for Huntington said, you can't understand, and what Huntington was trying to impress in this book, what is the promise of disharmony? You can't understand American politics without realizing there's always this gap between our high principles on the one hand and the actual practice of what our politics actually does on the other. These two things are always in tension with one another. And we're wrestling with this all the time. The way we feel we end up falling short of our high principles is just a key feature of our politics. There are other scholars, for example, when they talk about American politics, they'll often talk about it as a contest of self-interest. The northern states want this, the southern states want something else, the western states may swing the balance of the votes in Congress in one direction or another, or the rich may want this, the working class may want something else, there's fight between business and unions. We often talk about politics as a contest over who's going to get their self-interests. But Huntington wants to argue, no, our ideas matter. Our ideas do matter. Some people argue, well, they don't really matter. You can see, I've had people tell me this during the break, and we've heard people, our politicians don't live up to our principles. And some people draw the conclusion our principles don't matter. Huntington says, no, I disagree. Our principles matter because they animate so much of our political life. So many people are upset. So many people are out in the streets because they feel we're not living up to our principles. Or they feel that the protesters out there, or rioters and looters, are the ones who are falling short of what America holds dear. And they're upset about that. Notice how both sides of the aisle will often couch their arguments in terms of we're the ones fighting a liberal elite or the mainstream media or concentrated power. Conservatives say, we're the ones who are trying to stand up to the concentrated power of a liberal elite. And the liberals will come back and say, we're the ones trying to fight for equality of all people. Both sides, however much they disagree with one another, interestingly enough, often phrase their arguments as saying, we're the ones trying to get our politics to uphold the principles we hold dear. What Huntington goes on to argue in his book is that not only does this animate a lot of our politics, but there are certain periods in our history, and I'll end with this. I know there's probably other questions, but I'll end with this. He argues that there are certain periods in our history where this attempt to try and eliminate the gap, to try and reform our politics, really typifies most of all how our politics works. He argues that, well, in the 1770s, you should know this from your history textbooks. What was the big story? It was the American Revolution. We're trying to establish a country and establish, we're trying to establish a country and trying to establish a constitution to found a new republic based on these principles that we hold dear. The 1830s, that kind of eludes a lot of people. What was going on in the 1830s? That was a bit before that was a bit before we started really arguing about slavery, and that was before the Civil War. The 1830s was a period of what we call Jacksonian democracy, all right? Andrew Jackson and others argued that the voting rights that many states had put into law severely restricted who could vote. In Jackson's day and in an earlier republic, what states often said was the only people who could vote were not only white males, but you had to own property if you were going to vote, all right? So I sometimes play this game with my students in American politics class. If this were the 1790s or 1800s, who in this room could be allowed to vote? And I could see the students sometimes looking around, counting how many white males they were, and they're still wrong. Because what you have to do is count the number of people who own white males that own land, and the number is even smaller than that. In the 1830s, Jackson and his Democratic Party campaigned to win office, partly on a platform saying all white males should have the ability to vote. That may sound like small potatoes for us today, but that was the first big extension of voting rights in our history. And it was one of the first attempts to try and get ordinary people to be more involved to get more involved in the political process and to say, hey, it shouldn't just be people who have wealth, but everybody, including common people. That Jacksonian democracy does set a precedent for later extensions of the vote, like to African Americans and to women. Because we extended to all white males earlier, others could come along and effectively say, me too, we deserve that as well. And if he extended it for them, why not us? 1900s, we have what we call the progressive era. I know I'm running a bit over time, but please bear with me. We have what's called the progressive era. We're full swing in the Industrial Revolution. Some big companies making steel and oil. Nowadays, we have big tech firms, but back then it was big steel, big oil. Forming cartels, forming trusts, and colluding over the prices that they could charge high prices to customers. Teddy Roosevelt comes in on backing what's called a progressive program where he says, no, big businesses cannot just do whatever they want to their workers, can't just collude and charge whatever prices to customers. We're going to break up these trusts. And we're going to section off parts of the country into a national park service so that everybody can get on that land and see some of the beauties, especially out west, of what the country has to offer. It denied wealthy real estate developers the chance to buy up all the really good land across the United States. Again, trying to prevent the concentration of big economic power back in the 1900s. In the 1960s, well, I was born in 1969. You can tell me about the 1960s. Very much, of course, you know the story. A big story about how people are challenging big government power in terms of sending kids to fight in Vietnam for a war that increasingly people saw as not being in American interest, and a campaign for civil rights, talking about how to treat African Americans more equally. Huntington argued that there are certain periods in our history you can't really define our politics in terms of who gets more of the economic pie than somebody else. There are big fights over how we can reform our politics and get our practice to match our principles. Notice something about that period, those periods. How much distance of years is between those periods he identifies? It's roughly about what? 60, 70, it's about 60 years. Every 60 years, we have another of these periods, roughly. What is 60 years plus 1960s? Some of you see where I'm going with this. That, there's that old saying, you may be cursed with living in interesting times, or, what is what popular curse, may you live in interesting times. I want to emphasize something. The calendar does not determine our politics. People do. There's nothing set in stone saying we're going to have big revolutions every 60 years, but we look at so many things that are going on in the news today, and notice how my theme has been, we still wrestle with the Constitution, even today, in so many different ways. So many things that were typical of periods back then, a concern with concentrated political and economic power in elites, distrust of rulers in charge, swings in terms of who votes for what political party. At least for the 1830s, a new political party is created. 1990s and 1960s were known as times of political realignment, or party realignment. Different whole groups of people started voting for a different political party. Protests out on the streets, common to both the early 1900s and 1960s. So many of the things that were recipes for the politics of previous eras, yes, we are seeing today. And we may be going through one of those periods of creedal passion in the years to come. Maybe. Obviously, you and other people will ultimately be the ones to decide that. But I leave you with that thought, okay? All right, thank you. If you do have questions, I'm sorry I didn't leave that much time. I did want to talk about hunting. I didn't leave that much time at the end for questions, and I did run over time. But I will be hanging around for a few minutes afterwards. If you want to come speak to me about things I've said, I'll be perfectly willing to entertain questions. Thank you for coming. I hope to see you next week, okay?